As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. I met Sarah Perry during the Story Slam at the 2021 Hippocamp Writing Conference. As soon as she described her memoir about her mother's murder when she was 12, I knew I wanted to read it. So I bought a copy of After the Eclipse, packed it in my suitcase, and once I was home, placed it on my giant pile of books to be read. Over the coming months, writers from that conference emailed me saying, "Have you read Sarah Perry's book?" They couldn't stop raving about it. So I opened my copy and quickly discovered why it was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, Poets and Writers Notable Nonfiction Debut, and a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Pick. While I have many favorite books from 2023, this one ranks number one. Since reading it, I've read Sarah's essays in Off Assignment, HuffPost, and Elle. She holds an MFA in nonfiction from Columbia and is a professor of creative writing at the University of North Texas. Her next book, an essay collection titled Sweet Nothings, is forthcoming from Mariner HarperCollins. To read all about her awards, accolades, and publications, see the show notes for this episode. Before we get to today's episode, I have a few questions for you. What's your toughest experience? If you wrote about it, what would you like readers to focus on? How might you need to structure this book in order to make that happen? How would you take care of yourself while dealing with the toughest parts of your story, especially if that meant researching police reports or interviewing other people to bring a character to life? And what would you do with all that research? I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen to this episode. Now, it's my great honor to share this interview with Sarah Perry. Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. Sarah Perry, welcome to the Writing and Resilience podcast. I am so happy that you are here today.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, it is my absolute joy to talk with you about your book, which I'm going to hold up for the people who are going to see it on video. Here it is. After the Eclipse has probably been the book I have loved the most this year. I'm just going to say that. I love this book, and I'm excited to talk with you about it. And I want to begin by giving you a chance to let us know what you would like us to know about it, because we're not going to go through it in a blow by blow. I want people to buy your book. So
Thank
what would you
you.
like us to know about your book?
The number one thing I think that guided me in writing this book that I would like people to know is that it is more than a true crime story. It is equally the story of a single mother who struggled with poverty and with a lot of complicated family history and was really dedicated to me as her daughter and who was really kind of caught up in a web of misogynistic forces that you can kind of connect to the crime that occurred. But, it's not a whodunit. It's not primarily driven by figuring out why the crime happened or who did the crime.
I'm glad you said all of that, because when I was reading this, that aspect of it exists, in the
Mhm.
way this is structured. But to me, a big part of this was getting to know who this mother was. And what was this relationship like between this mother and daughter? I mean, that to me, that seemed like an equally important mystery. And I was so glad that you took time to capture that. And we're going to talk about the structure of the book later on, but you use some very specific strategies to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think, of course, the murder is, I think of it as a gravitational center to the book. I don't think the book would exist without it, so I'm not under any illusions there. But I had an experience that I think is really common to a lot of people who've experienced an acute trauma, in
Mhm.
that it was really hard for me to think about the time before, which meant that,
Yes.
not only did I lose my mother and she lost her life, I lost a lot of being able to experience memories of her before. The relationship was really severed in even more of a disruptive manner than if she had died not in a violent way.
Mhm.
So I was really driven to go back and, to whatever degree I could, reconstruct our relationship and look at it. And I also really wanted to reclaim it from this dark shadow that had fallen upon it because of this violent event. And I wanted there to be sections of the book where you're invited just to live in that relationship and think about it and analyze it and reconstruct it with me, without thinking about the murder and without having that in the forefront of your mind.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I really resonated with in terms of this book as a person who has lost someone in a violent way. I mean, it was a different, yours was murder, mine was suicide. But
Mhm.
I think when you have someone die suddenly, especially in a tragic way, that demarcation line of the before and the after becomes very entrenched. And as you said, that before can be a little amorphous. You can forget about that, especially in living through the trauma of the after and of whatever the event itself is. And
Mhm.
I felt that demarcation line, but I felt like there was this elegant balance between the before and the after, and getting to know this character and this mother and all of these the people that populate this book. And a lot of memoirists write specifically about their story. There's just what happened to them. But because you are building this mother character, there's of course events that are you were there for, things you were present for, but there are things that happened and a character that you are building that you were not even alive for. So,
Mhm.
how did you go about constructing the mother character in particular in building this book?
Yeah, so I think first I want to speak to motivation for doing that. I had had a social position as the prime mourner throughout. Mom was single and I was her only child, and I was present at the scene of the killing. So I had been asked for my testimony in a lot of different ways. And when I thought about making this more holistic document about who mom had been, I wanted to bring in other people's perspectives.
Mm.
I was also just self-conscious about it's actually a little ego driven, that I didn't want to be a daughter who was blind to any of her mother's flaws or complications. Like, I didn't want other people to be able to look at the text and think, I'm not convinced by this portrayal, or you've cast a really rosy glow over her, or like loss has made you less critical or less able to see things. And I just think it's such a huge gesture to say, I'm going to write a book about this person. I'm going to write about this event that actually affected a lot of people. It's arguably an essentially hubristic thing to do. You can say everybody else has their own experience, but everybody else's own experience is not necessarily going to be printed and distributed.
Right.
Um,
That
so
is
you
very
have to.
different. And I would say not only that, not just printed and distributed, but I have this written down here, so I'm going to get it out. New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, a poet's and writer's notable nonfiction debut, and Barnes and Noble's Discover Great New Writers Pick. Most people don't get that, but you
No.
did.
Yeah, I did, and I mean, I always say, like, I feel just incredibly blessed that everything happened for this book that I would have wanted to. Not all writers get that sort of praise, but also I'm just really gratified that after how hard I worked on this story and how high the stakes were for me and for other people, kind of edging back to this point, and also having felt this responsibility to depict mom well and think it's my opportunity to let her live on the page, that it's reached as many people as it has. And those accolades, of course, help it reach other people. And I just have some great reviews, and of course, it's an amazing feeling to feel like your reviewers are getting you and they're understanding what the aims of the project were. And I can get into this probably more when we talk about structure. This book is one thing, but it's also anti a lot of other things. There were a lot of ways this book could have gone that wouldn't have been in line with my emotional aims for it. But to go back to depicting mom, I suppose, it actually never occurred to me that this book could just be a memoir written out of my own memory.
Mm.
And I was surprised. I'm no longer surprised because people have asked me so many times now, but that was a really common question I got as I was working on it and after it came out. Like, why did you do journalistic research? Like, what prompted you to interview people? And like, I had to because I didn't know. Like I didn't know what mom was like before I was born, or I didn't know what she was like when she went out dancing or when I wasn't in the room. So I wanted to get that information from people, but I also just wanted to give people an opportunity to speak. And, the police had talked to me, the news had talked to me, but some people had never had the opportunity to have a moment of testimony. And that's kind of what I hoped would happen in interviews. Of course, I was really nervous about asking people for their time and asking them to relive this really disturbing event from many years prior. But as I advise my students all the time, like be thinking when you're approaching people for interviews, you might actually be providing them something.
Mhm.
And also, then, it's a great hedge against if people are upset later about how you've depicted anything or anyone, you can say, well, I did ask for your perspective and I did give you an opportunity to be involved here. What I found, I feel that I didn't have a whole lot of material with which to dramatically complicate mom's character. Time and again, people told me, your mother was really kind to people and really good at respecting people who weren't like her or who, other people like didn't have time for. And she was a really great mom and she was always really devoted to you. I did get like I did get some more like wild stories out of some of her friends, but it was always very touching because they would start talking and then they would say, "Sorry, I just need a minute because you're still 12 in my head and I'm like worried that Crystal's going to be mad at me for telling you." And I would assure them, I would say, I also have been to a party. It's okay. You can tell me these things. I think, with the family too, like we're very stereotypically New England, I think, in that like we hadn't had a whole lot of heart to hearts about
Mm.
our loss of my mother and their sister and how people had coped or perhaps not really coped and just moved on. For one thing, the protracted nature of the investigation, I think, kept a lot of the family members from being able. I think they were kind of waiting for the trial to
Mhm.
process what had happened, and then they had to wait 13 years. At some point, I told myself that my healing couldn't be contingent on the trial, which
Mm.
I think actually helped me write the book because I didn't want the resolution of the book to be contingent on the trial either. I didn't want that to be the thing that we were driving towards the whole time
Mhm.
because the trial doesn't change a whole lot about that other aspect, that other narrative line of the book, where we're following a mother and daughter, and a mother who's come out of a family who's working towards interrupting generational trauma and trying to build a life for herself. The trial doesn't have any bearing on any of that because ultimately we've still lost her.
Yeah, and you just said something really important about making a decision about what was going to give you your sense of resolution. Like, when anyone dies, that and especially when they die in a really tragic way, that pain never leaves, right? It's always going to be there. We learn how to hold space for it.
Mhm.
That's what changes. That's part of the healing process. But what did you do prior to writing this book that helped you work towards the resolution of this experience not being contingent on this trial? Like, I can't heal until this trial happens. How did you do that? What did you call on inside yourself?
Yeah, I think the answer is inherent in the first part of what you just said, in that I got to a point where I understood there wasn't going to be a resolution,
Yeah.
trial or no, and there wasn't going to be closure. Closure is my least favorite word. And
It's
that
my least favorite word as well.
it's the worst. Thank you. We're in a good club. I think closure, a lot of people ask me if writing the book gave me closure. And I always have to take a little breath because I find the question annoying. I'm not annoyed at the person, I'm annoyed at the concept. And I think it's actually, at its heart, it's a really empathetic question because people really want that for me. They would love for me to say yes, particularly people who've even, I think people who've read the book and who have experienced the pain of the book along with me want to hear that it has provided closure. And it hasn't, because that wasn't the aim. And I don't think that is a thing. Now, I don't know, like looking back at years before writing the book, I don't know if I can say what it is that brought me to that realization other than time. I think sometimes I'm a strange kind of pessimist because I think it was just my pessimism that brought me to that. I thought, well, I just don't think that's going to happen, so I'm not going to wait for it. And I would always go back to this guiding principle, though, of like, what would mom want for me? Like, mom wouldn't want me to be actively suffering or not pursuing love or life or not like really getting out there and taking chances and living because my loss of her wasn't resolved yet because I didn't have because what does a trial give you? It gives you a trial is essentially a narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the criminal justice system is like this narrative under these certain sets of constraints and expectations. So when you find out who did it, you have the whole story, right? So I think it was weird and ironic too to be crafting a story out of this, but also be thinking like there are real limitations to what a story can do.
Mm-hmm.
And like, how do I make this story so it doesn't presume to provide something that is not, that I don't believe is real?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think honoring those limitations of story is so important because I mean, I personally believe that there are questions we can settle for ourselves through the writing process. Does that bring closure? And if you're listening, like I have my little quotes on, no, it doesn't. It settles something in our nervous system. I think that's the best we can hope for.
Right.
And then maybe in that settling, it invites other people into our questions. And so then they can begin to think about how does this work for me? What is this? One of the things that I remembered the most about this in terms of the mother character is her hands. You know, I will never forget her hands. And I think, people always think of, well, how do you describe a person? How do you bring them to life? And I think that was one of the things you did so beautifully was to focus on her hands and this idea that she was this maker in a certain way.
Yeah, that's really beautiful because people ask, like, did the book give you closure? And it didn't, but it gave me like Lisa saying that about mom's hands and like mom's hands like living in your heart and your consciousness. And like that's so much more powerful to me, and to think that like multiple people, maybe hundreds of people have that awareness of her as a person who lived on the earth. Like that's just incredible to me. I just feel I know it sounds kind of cheesy, but like I feel really honored that like all the things that had to align for me to write this book and to get it out there happened so that I could like what a great privilege to have other people know my like beloved lost person.
I think one of the most powerful things that we can do is say someone's name to be invited into that memory, to keep that memory going. So there's, this way that your mom is eternal. I mean, in this book, there's this
Mhm.
artifact where she gets to live on, and I can say, you said hundreds, I'm going to say thousands. I'm going to say this for you mainly
Okay.
because I met you at Hippo Camp, which
Mhm.
is a fabulous writing conference, and I knew a lot of people who bought your book at that conference, and little whisper trails find me, of people saying like, oh my gosh, have you read
Oh,
Sarah's book?
great.
Have you read Sarah's book? So that definitely has happened over the course of the time since I've been introduced to your book. And so I would imagine that is just one of many ripples out there of all of the work that you have done. And there was this moment of change in the book, and that's going to lead us to talk about structure.
Okay,
But I just want to stop and probably fawn. I'm going to fawn for a second. Is that okay?
that's fine. It never gets old, so go ahead.
I am looking for the day when my book is published and people are doing that for me. So I'm going to do it for you. I told you before I hit the record button that the writing itself is beautiful. And one of the things that people who have tough stories struggle with is, how do I write when I don't remember? Or
Mhm,
when I was dissociating or trying to survive and there's nothing there, which
mhm,
happens a lot when people experience trauma because that's how we survive. And there's this moment where we're in the middle of the story of the mother's murder and the things that the narrator experienced. And we have this beautiful paragraph, which I'm going to read if that's okay with you.
sure.
Memory recedes here, falling into a hospital white mist, an inconsistent curtain that rolls over the hours, obscuring some moments, parting to let others through. In the next clear shot, a woman, the nurse, is leading me down a hallway, gently guiding me by the arm. We're headed to the chaplain's office, and I'm vaguely bothered by this because Mom and I aren't religious. No one seems to understand that this isn't where we go in times of tragedy, but I don't know where we do go, so I let them lead me. There's just this poetic way that you talk about the things that you don't remember or the ways that you do remember them. And because you're also a writing instructor, I'm curious to know, what strategies were you employing, or what did you do, or what would you tell your writing students about how to navigate these challenges of memory?
Yeah, there are a lot of different things I say. Usually the first thing I say is that I can't make any promises, but often once you start really engaging in your story, there's more there than you think there is.
Mhm.
And I think about this metaphor of seasickness. Like if you get on a boat and you're anxious about being seasick, like the anxiety of your body, I'm guessing, makes you more likely to be seasick. And
Yes.
this like I feel I always feel a tightness when people say, I can't remember. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Like
Mm-hmm.
the idea of going in there might be terrifying, going in there into the memory. It might be sadness about thinking that there's nothing there. And I think, like, if you can try to relax beyond that feeling and be receptive and let things come to you, just once you start thinking about that time and try to do it without like striving and strain, often you do remember more. I always advise well, you have to balance immersion with safety, right?
Yes.
Especially if it's really difficult material. But you can immerse in ways that are indirect. Like if what you're writing about happened in a certain year, you can listen to the top 10 songs of the time
Mm-hmm.
because music and memory is really really tightly joined, right? And that can even be a way that could be fun and nostalgic for you to think about that time, to just sort of do that sort of time travel back to see what you can recall. And any other like sensory experiential immersion, if you're able to go to the place and maybe this happened in a town that's far from where you live now, if you go to the town and just walk around, go to the
Mm-hmm.
post office, just like some mundane locations, just sort of smell and be and put your body there, because memory is this mysterious process. We don't entirely understand how it works. So thinking about spell casting, what you can do. But I also think, just like the paragraph you read there, what I'm doing is what I think I'm doing now that I think about it is that, like, I'm not purporting to remember more than I do. Like, what I
Mm-hmm.
want to do is replicate for the reader my experience of remembering that time. So it's more that I'm doing that than that I'm replicating the precise experience for them. Because the book is a lot about memory, as any memoir kind of inevitably is. So it's really the vicarious experience that the reader's having there, I think, is actually more me sitting at the desk thinking about
Mm-hmm.
it, or like the emotional imprint that I carried forward into the years. Like that's what will be affecting me. And then shortly after that, we do the memory sharpens. You see my grandmother either right after or right before that. I can't remember. You see one of the suspects is in the hallway.
Mhm.
So the fuzziness is balanced with these more clear moments so that the reader doesn't feel like everything is really floaty, like they don't have anywhere to land. And of course, just like there's so much power in any physical detail you can give. Like if you can't remember the scene, but you know that they haven't changed the tiles in the hallway to
Mhm.
your high school or whatever, you can go there and look at the tiles. Like they're still there, you can import them in, like, that's still nonfiction, that's allowed. Now I'm doing air quotes
Yeah.
because people get anxious about what's allowed. On the other hand, I think sometimes, really depending on who you're working with, and I don't make this call unless I know someone well or they seem very like a very familiar type of writer, I think sometimes anxiety about not remembering is a self-protective move to delay the work
Mhm.
and not do it yet and say, "Well, I don't know anything." But, like, you're having the conversation because you have an impulse towards doing the work, but it may be the case that it's not safe for you to do yet. So, I think it's important to pay attention to that at the same time.
Absolutely. And one of the first questions I'll ask when someone says they don't remember or they're not able to get their work done is, what would it take to make this safe?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
because when we feel safe, we're more able to remember. And then sometimes giving people a purpose for going back, especially if we're talking about high trauma. Like, there are plenty of times where it's like, no, do all of these other things. And I tell people, create a playlist, just like you were talking about. I'm like, create a playlist for your book.
Mhm.
Go listen to that. Go for a walk. Go to the place. Do all of these things that are the natural triggers for memory. Because
Mhm.
as you were saying, memory begets memory begets memory. And once you start remembering, there's a lot you're going to remember. But I love that idea of import the details that have not changed,
Mhm.
ground the reader in detail, and then what you also do in that is use metaphor, right? If there is a piece that you can't do, then metaphor can be a way of grounding the reader, and you can ground the reader in the beauty of language, but don't let that be the thing that gets you off the hook.
Right, right. Yeah. Metaphor is really good to bring up too, and, like, looking at our sample text here, like the white mist. The reader has something to imagine. It doesn't matter that it's not literal, but there's something there to there's material to get us across the gap from one remembered moment to the next, right?
Yes, if you're writing, having these tools can help you get things down so that you are able to make sense of them, because that's the whole purpose. And making sense, again, doesn't mean you know the full story or that you've somehow created like capital T truth, because that doesn't
Mhm,
ever happen, but that
mhm,
you can do something with it. And that is very powerful. And one thing that I noticed that happened in this book is there's a way that the narrator is navigating this loss. We're also learning who this mother is, but there's a way that she's very much the victim of her circumstances. We see her trying to survive, trying to figure things out, being questioned by the police many, many, many times. But then, right before the trial, something changes. And there's a way that, when I say hero, I mean hero in the sense of storytelling, in the sense that,
mhm,
you know, narrator in their own power, right? That's what I mean by that. There's this way that this narrator becomes this badass. Like, she has this plan, she has this agenda that changes. And as I was reading, I'm not going to give it away. I don't want to tell people what it is because, again, I want them to read your book. But I was like, whoa, she has changed. What is
mm,
this? And
mm.
as you were crafting the story and going through this, what did you notice changed in you as you were thinking about these parts of your story?
That's a good question. I will say the number one, other than, things I've said previously about making this monument to mom and any sort of, like, social justice work I'm wanting to do and looking at the broader societal patterns around this violence, the number one thing that it gave me personally is a coherent timeline of self,
Mm-hmm.
because I really had this psychological splitting of a few, not only a before and after, really a before, and then there was kind of teenage Sarah, and then there was Sarah in her 20s, and kind of up to the trial, and making one coherent timeline, even though it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't just march forward chronologically, reunited me with all my former selves is the best way I can put it. And I have to say I'm thinking about what turn or moment you're noticing, and I don't even know if it's clear to me in the narrative, but I think I wasn't waiting on the trial to heal, but there was a part of me that had been paying attention to what I would need to go through that experience in a way that was I would have used the word victorious then. It was very important for me to perform well after having waited for it. So, for example, as soon as the investigator called me to tell me that they had a DNA match, I knew I had about a year until the trial would be on the docket, and I immediately went into therapy. I had never willingly gone to therapy, but I was going for this purpose. I said, I need to be the best possible witness, and I need to show up, you know, kind of as mom's substitute in this because she can't be here to represent herself, and I need to really figure my shit out was the
Hmm.
feeling. Um, and a lot of things in my life that had felt like maybe distractions or were unhealthy coping mechanisms were suddenly put up against what I felt to be a great duty. And it was easier to pare those things away at that time. I don't know if this exactly answers your question.
It does, because that's the area where I was like, the energy has shifted,
Yeah.
things are different, and I think there's a reclaiming there of power, and I think for the very reasons that you just said, that you are the representative of your mom, right? And so that's a piece of the story, and I want people to pay special attention to that piece, because there, even if you're like, I don't know exactly what you're talking about, that there's a fulcrum. Like, if you go back, there was a fulcrum, an energy shift in how I felt like the narrator was owning their story, right? There's this, like, something changed in that, and it changed in me too. Like, I was like feeling the story in a different way, and I loved that
Mm.
that happened, because there is this elegant back and forth, this before and after of the story. And there's a lot of different ways that you could have structured this book. You could have done, let me tell you about my mom, and, back in the day, blah blah blah, and then I was born, and then these things happen,
Mhm.
and then, like, this horrific event. Or you could have started with that and gone back to the beginning. I mean, there's lots of ways to do it, but this oscillating, almost like dual timeline, before and after, works so well. And you do see it a lot in true crime, and I've seen this. It's almost like an alternative to the braid, because it's not quite a braid, but it is. It's like, because you have the two timelines. How did you
Mm.
come up with this structure, and what did you have to learn or navigate in order to get it right?
Yeah, so I always welcome answering this question because this is the thing I worked on the hardest. And I wrote the book over, let's say, a 6-year period. It wasn't a book that one could read until year 4 because I was continually searching for the structure. It was really important to me that we didn't start with the murder and then it just kind of go forward from there with some sort of like quick service backstory, and then we're primarily involved in the investigation, which is a lot of popular true crime, right?
Mm-hmm.
I knew it was a big thing to pull off, but I wanted the reader to be as invested in mom's life as they were in the mystery and drama of her death and the investigation. So, I also, to back up to kind of to this question of memory, but also how to write difficult material, I wrote the book very out of order. So anytime I would sit down to write it, I would just write the part that I was subconsciously called to.
Mm-hmm.
Or, if I had just completed some research, I might write something that was related to that while it was fresh. If I was feeling particularly strong, I might go ahead and tackle a part of the book that I knew would be harder, like the night of the murder. If I was feeling pretty strung out, I would work in safer territory.
Mm-hmm.
So for the first 2 years or so, I just created pages. I had no structure. I had no idea of how I would put them together. So I had all these movable parts. I think part of that too came out of just the pragmatics of writing for 2 years in an MFA on workshop deadlines and to workshoppy length. So I had these units that could kind of stand alone as reading experiences. And then I started pushing them around. At some point, I had a version that probably had about as many units as the book, which I think is around 42 at the moment in the end, that were just thematically related, the way you would make a playlist. You know, you listen to the end of one song and then you listen to the beginnings of the next songs and you kind of like vibe it out and put them next to each
Yes.
other. Or maybe like the metaphorical language matched or had some sort of transition. And I put it together kind of like a big long poem because I was like, I'm resisting all chronology and I'm resisting the imperatives of the true crime whodunit. And I was pretty pleased. And I gave it to my poet friend, and she was like, "This is fantastic." And I gave it to somebody else, and they said, "I don't know what the fuck is going on." So I said, "Oh, that's right. You have to know what's going on." And two, like there were things. It was really complex in this book to think about, like, what do I want the reader to know at what point? How much can they know about mom's life? Like, we have other contenders for who might have killed her. Where do I want to replicate my years long suspicion about a certain person? And where do I not want to do that because it feels unethical or problematic now to be inviting the reader to think about them that way? But then, of course, like, you know, without getting too far into it and giving anything away, like, I'm really interested too in the fact that she was killed by a certain person, but were there other people who had the capacity? And why did they have the capacity? Because of toxic misogyny, etc.
Mhm.
I'm going all over the place with this answer, but it's because like the structure really, I felt like answering the structure was the most important thing to figure out to make sure that the book did what I wanted it to do. I think I had had some version of the before and after early, but didn't really execute it. I only had notes on it, and I tried probably 4 or 5 other things. I think there was a version that was sort of like the before and after, but more in acts instead of in chapters.
Mhm.
And then eventually I went back to that idea. And I think the thing that I realized was that I was able to make sure that mom was alive on the page much further into the book. Because if I started it, you know, if I'd started at the very beginning of chronology and then at some point she died, you would have never seen her again.
Yeah.
So she would have been essentially backstory, and we're never as, and backstory doesn't feel as real in some
Mhm.
way, right? And what I wanted to insist upon was, you know, her life was just as real as her death.
Yes.
The long answer. I mean, it was mostly trial and error, Excel spreadsheets, sticky notes on the wall, note cards. I'm big on physically pushing around representations of the book. I bought Scrivener. I quickly realized it was a procrastination tool for me more than anything. So I put it away. I will say writing a book like this and restructuring it so many times just in one big long running Word document was not easy. Not what I would recommend. But you know what it forced me to do was think about what each unit was. I have a brilliant friend who teaches this way. She says, think about what it's doing and what it's saying and what it's doing.
Mhm. Yep.
What is it saying? What is it doing? And I had to label those things just to keep it all in my head, you know, to look at all of it from a bird's eye view and figure out where I wanted everything.
It sounds like you and I would be great team teachers because of
Oh,
many
let's
of
do
the
it.
things that you do. I'm like, oh yeah, all of my students are going to be like, oh, Lisa's not the only one that teaches this way. Maybe there are other people who come up with these ideas because yes, I
Yeah.
think yeah, to me, you have to be able to touch and feel your story, and getting away from your computer is one of the best ways to do that. And that, what does it do, what does it say, that's one of the things I get people to do. I have someone right now who's working on more of a collage style of memoir, and we did exactly that poetic thing of like, what are these linkage points, but also what are these linkage points that also create a sense of story, like, the whiff of narrative, because if you don't have narrative, you have no idea what it means. It's like, it sounds good. And certain people will read it for that reason, but so many
Mhm.
readers, they need that some sort of coherence, that there needs to be some coherence of the story. And when I was reading this, I cared as deeply about the mother, the narrator, how is she surviving this, right? That was important to me, and who did this. And I love that you took me on all of these different trails, and I didn't know who did it until the very end, which was very satisfying for me because I read so many books. I can predict a lot of things.
I
I'm
bet.
always like, I don't know if you have this, like, we'll be watching a TV show and I'll be like thinking about the beginning and the end. I'm like, this is what's going to happen in the final episode. Do, do, do. And it's because stories tend to work in certain ways. But I was surprised by that. And it was an afterthought, which I'm glad because of what you hoped to do with this, because
Mhm.
I cared about, like, well, how is this narrator making it? What are they doing with this story? How are they making it to adulthood and figuring things out to the best they can? Because we never figure these things out perfectly. That's unrealistic. But there's this beauty of that, and how do we know this mother? And I think structure is one of the things people struggle with the most. And what I always tell people is structure has this like important relationship with narrative arc. Like when you know what you're trying to accomplish, right? So what is that arc of change or of the story? Then you're going to figure out what structure works well. Like a book that I love is The Fact of a Body by
Mhm.
Alex Marzano Lesnevich. And it fits in the kind of the memoir true crime genre. And it's this braided narrative, and how there is an arc for each of these timelines, or, the braids. Like that each braid has to have its own arc. And it's about that juxtaposition of how do these stories speak to each other in a way that tells what I call the super story, right? Because it's got to tell,
Mm.
like, it's not just like this story and then that story. It's like, well, the two stories are put together because they tell another story. And I think
Mhm.
the who done it with the mom in particular, and then you have this daughter who's left to fend for herself in many ways, allows you to have that conversation around misogyny. Like, why do young women get murdered? Like, how does this
Mhm.
happen? How does someone become a victim of this kind of crime? And is this random, or are there reasons? And I
Mhm.
think the way you juxtapose these things allows for that conversation to happen. And I began to question, fairly or unfairly, some of these other characters, like, well, how are we operating in this society, and like what is okay or not okay, or how are these things happening? And I loved that.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just thinking of various things that would have led you to question certain characters more that I accessed in the police records, but not everything could go in. I think like anytime you're writing, like here, there really is, I think for some readers, and then I hope by the end they're not motivated by this, but for some readers, there's a real blank spot in the narrative in that, like, I can't tell you why he killed mom, you know? But what I'm hoping is to bring them up against this desire for a why and this like weird presumption that we could come up with a why, like that there's some story that would make some kind of sense. And I feel like that motivation like permeated some of the actions and words of people who are more peripheral to the story too. Even like as I was having conversations with people about writing this book, or interviews that I was having with people. And I think like just like with a lack of memory, sometimes all you can do with a narrative whole is to sort of just like offer what's around it
Mm-hmm.
for the reader's consideration. Like, well, here's what's around it. Like, here were the conditions of quote unquote the victim's life, and here were the conditions of the perpetrator's life. And like, here's the web that they're sitting in. And then here are some of the narrative expectations that even people who quote unquote should have known better have. Like here's what we're still working against. And that's part of why I was really resistant to closure and resolution in this story too, because like it's not closed and resolved. It's still happening. It's happening this very moment to somebody, I'm sure.
Yeah. And the reality is that there is no reason why. I mean,
Right.
you can come up with factors and things that you can call the reason, but for a lot of these things there is no reason why. And part of the healing and the settling, right? The settling is acceptance that there will never be a why. Like that question
Mhm.
will not be answered, and life can go on anyway. And I think the way you develop these other characters allows us to imagine potential whys, because we have how certain people behave, and and what we know about the actual perpetrator, and we can say, I wonder if, but there's no certainty, which
Mhm.
matches reality. And in order for you to be able to do this, you had to do a lot of different interviews, and you also looked back at the police records.
Mhm.
And I would imagine that some of those interviews were easy or took you to places that maybe were delightful or happy, or it was like, meaningful to connect with someone. And then a piece that I would imagine probably wasn't that way is like going to the police station and looking at those records and
Mhm.
amassing all of this material. Two questions I want to ask are: one, what did you call on inside yourself in order to be able to cope with what you might have encountered? And then how did you decide what actually belonged when you probably had this mass amount of research that you had done?
Yeah. The first question is difficult to answer because I feel I don't want to act as though my process was healthy throughout. Sometimes it was a dark compulsion, and I wasn't sometimes I wasn't thoughtful about my capacity, but I gradually learned to like, I'm a big believer in containers, literal and metaphorical for work like this. Like, you talk about the police records, and I was living in New York when I was writing this book, so of course I was writing in my bedroom, but I had to have a rule, like, I wouldn't go to bed unless the documents were in their box and covered.
Nice.
They had to be put away. They were only out at certain times when I was introspecting and giving myself consent to be looking at them and thinking like, is the rest hopefully like thinking, is today a safe day to be doing this? Like, do I have other
Mm-hmm.
demands on my time? Is there anything else that might be happening that's difficult? Do I have time to recover after this? I would say I'm going to look at these things for 90 minutes and then I'm going to stop, even if I'm on a roll. Because you get in a roll, on a roll, and like I'm a dissociative coper. So I'm more likely, if I'm going to a bad place, to actually kind of shut down emotionally and get more activated intellectually.
Mm-hmm.
So you think you're doing well and you're feeling very smart, and you're like, oh, I'm going to think about what this autopsy figure means or whatever. I feel like I'm being really productive right now, but I learned to try to make contracts with myself and say like you need to back up and check in, because invariably if I overworked myself or I did too much in a session, I would have a terrible trauma hangover,
Mm-hmm.
and then also feel terrible, which is the human thing to think about, but also be unable to work for a week or so.
Right.
So, I'm not sure if I'm answering exactly your question, but
I want
I
to say that you've answered it beautifully.
okay, great.
And I also love that the honesty of like, yeah, I didn't do it perfectly. And sometimes it was unhealthy, because that's the reality for all of us, right?
Yeah, yeah,
None of us have it all figured out, and we all do that trial and error. So I love that. So then I've
yeah.
interrupted you with that part two of the question about
Okay,
what'd you do with
great.
that research?
What I do with the research, I really tried, like, I felt a great responsibility to not drag anybody into this narrative who didn't belong. So sometimes, I would have material on a certain story angle that would bring somebody in where I would think like, I don't think I really actually on second thought need this in order to tell the story of mom's life or her death. So really thinking about like taking the responsibility of representing other people pretty
Mm-hmm.
seriously helped me limit the field. I also had a principle that I was really trying not to have any research conversations that didn't have any sort of organic personal component.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, like, we all had to accept that, like, I wasn't going to be making these phone calls and turning my recorder on and have a list of questions unless I was doing this project. But memoir folds in on itself, of course, because the project was
Yes.
personally motivated. It's not something that someone had commissioned for me. It wasn't just my job. So I wanted to make sure that every conversation had like a human component to it and
Mm-hmm.
some sort of like psychological sense to it. So I think there were also things that another journalist might have done who was external to the story that I just didn't do because they didn't seem to be, they had no like heart forward reason to
Mm-hmm.
do. And I was very clear that well, I became clear that I wasn't going to research, quote unquote, the other side. I was not going to talk to the killer, to his family or friends. So that really kept everything more connected to mom and to me. And then just as far as the volume, I think probably what I did was try to keep things grounded in the physical and in scenes and
Mm,
let that naturally suggest what from the research was helpful and needed to go in. Which brings me back actually to thinking about the experience of writing the trial and the period immediately before the trial, because the trial was a struggle because it took me a little while to get out from under the transcript
hmm.
even like I think that's one reason for like you could probably look at it on a syntax level, and part of what's happening in that section is that it's becoming a little more businesslike and clean and more and probably feels more confident and self-assured in that way. And part of that I think is that like I started with versions that felt more like legalese and were
Hmm.
kind of lockstep marching through the transcript because there isn't a lot of scenic material. It's a bunch of people sitting in a room for 7 days. That's why you have me on the treadmill at the hotel. Like that's something else that I did. So I think that was the case where it's harder to figure out what goes in and what goes out. And of course, the prosecution and to a lesser degree, the defense are making these like chains of logic. So everything is
Hmm.
kind of stuck to and connected to everything else. And it took me a while to get things like pulled apart more. But if you look at it, like the proportion, I think, of time to words on the page in the trial is much different. Like it's a lot more words on the page per real life than probably anywhere else in the book. Maybe the night of the murder wins there. I'm not sure. Sorry,
I'm
I'm
gonna have
thinking
to
this
look that
all out
up.
loud. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It has because I think the trial is 2 or 3 chapters, and I was motivated to make it as short as I could because I didn't want it to have the primary focus. But there was just so much there. Yeah, I mean, some of it is just case by case too. Something that's interesting to think about in this particular story is how connected people are in a small town.
Hmm.
There were a lot of things that I discovered along the course of research where I thought, oh, that's so crazy. Like that person is that person's cousin. Like that conversation happened. That's wild. But then I would back up and I would think, well, from the perspective of the community itself, it really isn't. Like it's very natural. Like it completely makes sense that those people are connected, which also just speaks to my real like insider outsider feeling in telling this story.
Hmm.
You would think I would feel like the ultimate insider, but I didn't because I hadn't lived in Maine in a really long time. And Maine has a very finely delineated sense of who is a Mainer and who is from away, as we say. And I had been a person who had become from away in a lot of my presentation and in my cultural references. And I didn't want it to sound like a book that had been written by somebody who had parachuted in.
And I can tell that you put a lot of work into making that happen because it does feel very much there's this regional feel to this book, and there's this way that the sense of place is really important, and which is interesting, like this idea of not necessarily home, that's not a word I would use, but when I was reading other things that you had written, this concept of home and of a person being home or of the feeling of home has shown up in different pieces that I've read beyond your book. So
Mm.
it's interesting that that theme comes out, and I can imagine many different reasons why that might be a thematic element in the work that you do. But because we have to wrap up, I have a
Okay,
couple of final questions. Though I
great.
will, though, if you want to talk about that concept of home, I want, if you have anything you'd like to say about that.
I think it probably comes up in my work because my relationship to the idea is so complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I would say primarily I probably have a pretty portable sense of home. And I think that's why I make great efforts to cultivate meaningful relationships with people wherever I am. On the other hand, it's like I don't know where I'm from. When I
Yeah.
say Maine is home, like the idea makes me physically anxious. New York feels like home, but I left willingly. And also, like, that's another place where I'm very sensitive to this idea of people who are not from a place presuming that they are, because I was just raised to think that way. I move, I get my space nested as quickly as I can. Like, the domestic environment is really, I don't have super high standards, but I just want everything to be cozy in the way I want it, because I have to be making my own little shelter. So yeah, I think that's why it comes up, because I'm kind of continually trying to figure that out.
And I think after reading your book and seeing all of the different home experiences that you also were in, it makes sense that you would figure out where home is for you and to claim it. And I love that you do that wherever you are and that you create that for yourself. That's so important. And as a person who grew up in a very small town where there's like insiders and outsiders, and I am now the outsider who talks
Mhm.
different and has different things, I relate to that experience because I also have a complicated relationship with home. So I love that these things show up in your work and that we've had this wonderful conversation. What is the best piece of writing advice that you have been given?
This is going to sound contrary to most of the rest of our conversation, but I think the most useful writing advice I ever got was to think about it like a job.
I love that.
So sometimes if you don't want to do it, you have to do it. If you think about it like a job, you can really feel grateful. You can think, holy shit, that's my job. My job is to tell stories and presume that people will read them and also help other people tell their stories. Like, that's amazing. So maybe the contrast between the activity and what we might think of, what we might expect from labor is helpful. Because I think I'm very like anxious in approaching the page. Once I'm at the desk, writing is hard, of course, it's always hard, but the hardest part of writing for me is really getting myself to show up and getting past that initial resistance to entering a text. But if I think about it like a job, it just depersonalizes it in a way that's really helpful for me.
I love that. And I tell people that all the time because
Oh, you
if it's a
do?
job, yeah, because if it's a job, it's serious, right? You're going to do it.
Yeah.
You don't go to work and like work when you feel like it unless you're interested in getting fired, right? You show
Right,
up
right.
even when you don't want to and you try.
Yeah,
And I think that's the best you can do.
right.
So, what is the thing that you do most? And we've talked about home and how you nest and creating that sense of home for yourself. What is something you do that helps you nurture your resilience?
This is very basic, but I work out really hard because I am a person whose brain is always cranking and I'm anxious and I can perseverate a lot. So working out helps me a lot because I'm not thinking for that period of time and I'm doing something difficult that isn't complicated. You did it or you didn't do it, and you can think like, okay, I can show up and do hard things and I don't have to, like, there doesn't have to be all this complication around it. That and probably real phone calls with people I care about. And I'll advise students to do this too, particularly if you're writing about your past. Like, keep in touch with people who know you now, even like right
Yes.
after you've had a writing session. Like, think about whose conception of yourself is the like empowered contemporary you who has known you for a minute, so they really know you, but who maybe doesn't even know the you who experienced all this heartbreak and trauma,
Yeah.
and like really stay in touch with yourself through their eyes, the one who's only seen you, I guess, only seen you strong, and maybe not only seen you strong, but only seen the version of you that you worked so fucking hard to make, I
Hmm.
suppose. Right. And I think too, just having, I am most resilient when I have a regular writing practice, no matter what I'm doing with it. When I'm staying in touch with the process part, when I'm doing something at least every couple of days that might not even ever make it to anybody's eyes. That's just really when I feel like no matter what else is happening, no matter what else I'm doing, I'm going to somehow be able to handle it.
I love that answer. You have something else coming out soon?
I do. So we're calling it a memoir in essays. It's called Sweet Nothings. It's 100 flash essays, each about a different kind of candy. And it grew out of feeling pretty burnt out in the wake of writing after the eclipse and diving into a second memoir project, which was a lot about sex and love and romance in my life, which I felt like I hadn't been able to delve into as deeply as I wanted. And then feeling just a lot of heaviness there. And
Mhm.
2020 coming upon us. And I said, okay, you know what? I'm just going to get up every morning and I'm going to write little exercises about this thing that gives me a lot of joy. I am a real fan of sugar. And I did these free associative little things. I would write them before I was really even awake in the morning. And at some point, my agent asked me to see pages of something. And I said, well, I have 65,000 words about candy. Do you want to see that? I don't know what it is. And it was occasionally funny, and I'm really not used to being funny. And she left it. So we sold it to Mariner, and it's coming out next fall.
Nice. That reminds me of, have you ever read Ross Gay's work, The Book of
It
Delights?
it's very Book of Delights. Yes. Yeah. I love Book of Delights and I love Sarah Ruhl's 100 essays I don't have time for.
Yes.
So it's very much one of those sorts of books. And I'm just really pleased to see this motion towards joy in writing lately. I was also just really interested in the aesthetic challenge of writing about the joyous and the mundane.
Mm-hmm.
So many memoirs and so much personal writing is about trauma and strife and disaster. And I thought, yeah, I mean, narrative is inherently about conflict and change, but like, can I make art that is worth somebody's time that's not about these huge moments in our lives too?
Mm-hmm.
Because the project is also really interested in like, okay, so maybe you didn't have closure, but you processed the hugest, most devastating thing to ever happen to you, and you had a profound experience, and you feel like you've healed some. Like, what next? How do you, how can you be present and make meaning of the more mundane moments in your life so that time isn't just passing you by? Like, how can we respect the smaller things with our attention?
That sounds both wonderful and very healthy.
I'm
I mean,
trying.
yeah, like because, and that's all we can do is try because I think I know a lot of memoirists who are like, okay, I've just done this really dark thing. Now let me explore this other dark thing. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want to do, but it can be, you can actually train your brain to only see the darkness.
It's true. It's
And
true.
being able to see both is an important part of embracing the human experience, all of it.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that is one thing I love about your book is that yes, it has a bunch of darkness, but it also embraces the light because we get to know your mom. And so thank you so much for writing that. And if people want to follow you so that they can get this book and also be ready for the next one, what are the best ways that they can find you and keep in touch?
Sure. I am on Instagram. I'm at Sarah Perry 100, and I have a website. It's sarahperryauthor.net. Sometime in the next few months, I will have a newsletter sign up on the website for real this time. And those are my only two internet homes. I'm not very online. I'm
There
I'm
is
kind of
nothing wrong
happy.
with that.
I'm kind of happy to have missed the whole Twitter thing, I think.
And that's a good thing because,
Yeah.
I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about whether or not it's healthy to be in all of these different places and what do you do with all of that. So I would imagine that having a very limited internet or electronic home allows you to have a richer, actual, for real home. And that's more important.
I hope so. I hope so. But yeah, I'm available via Instagram DMs and emails on my website.
And if you missed what she just said about where she is, you will find that in the show notes. Well, Sarah,
Great.
thank you so much for showing up today and for this wonderful conversation. It has been an absolute delight to spend time with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, writers, have you started a memoir only to get lost in a sea of stories that never seems to end, or completed a few drafts and now wonder if the structure you've chosen for your memoir is the best one for your book? Or have you queried a few agents only to hear, sorry, it's not for me, or worse, radio silence? You might not know this, but structure is the concept writers struggle with most. They worry about it during their first drafts and all along the way. There's a very good reason why this happens. An ineffective structure can lose readers, trap you in an endless cycle of revision, or worst of all, get you so lost you give up. But that doesn't have to happen to you. On February 21st, I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman to bring you Find the Memoir Structure That Works for You. During this webinar, you'll discover why writers crave structure and why stories need them. You'll also learn how to assess your skills and vision for this project, explore the most common memoir structures, and find out what skills are needed to nail each one. Best of all, it's only $25. That's right, $25. Plus, you don't even have to be available on February 21st because everyone who registers will get the recording, transcript, Q&A, and my comprehensive workbook. To learn more or register, go to janefriedman.com/courses or make it super easy on yourself and just click the link in the show notes. You'll leave with a new understanding of not just how stories are told, but confidence in your vision for your book, as well as a clear plan for getting there. To find the memoir structure that works for you, click on the link in the show notes, then register for this course. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing Your Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.